Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to fit the radio and the ESC to the 3Racing X reel. For the ESC we have another Hobbywing 1080, a rather good affordable brushed ESC that you can tune to suit a particular truck. I've got at least half a dozen of them now and they all work perfectly. For the receiver we've got a 6-channel FlySky unit. We only need 3 to run the truck, steering, throttle and gear shift, but the extra 3 will be handy for the planned accessories. Not shown here, it's going to be paired up with a FlySky GT3B modified to unlock up to 8 channels. So here's the chassis then, and we've already got the servos and motor fitted, but they're not connected to anything. Usually there's a conveniently placed box or tray, we just pop the radio in and plug things in. Unfortunately, 3Racing's effort, while solid and well made, does seem to be a bit of an afterthought. If we were to fit the receiver and ESC in the box at the rear of the chassis, it'll be out of the way and well protected. However, the leads from the steering servo come up quite a bit short. I can imagine some engineer having a bit of a moment of realisation, followed by the inclusion of the servo extension leads. Not a bad workaround as such, although they are comically long. You see, any piece of wire will have an amount of resistance for a length. The longer the wire, the more resistance. In the case of servos, it won't bother the signal much, but the power and ground will affect the servo's performance. You see, when we try and pull lots of current, and in the case of a steering servo it can be well over an amp or even 2 for a more powerful one, because of the resistance the voltage at the servo end will drop, effectively limiting the power of the servo. The motor wires are a similar story. They're excessively long, having to go all the way from one end of the chassis to the other. The wires are a lot chunkier, but remember that the motor is going to be drawing a lot more current than the servo when the wheels get bound up. Now, if the chassis was really tight on space, I could accept it as a compromise, rather than an afterthought. But there's a space by the gearbox, opposite the gearshift servo, that will just about fit both the receiver and the ESC, bringing them far enough forward we don't need any of the extensions. So after some fiddling with SketchUp and some 3D printing, we have a few bits ready to fit to the chassis. Now, due to the way the 3D printer builds parts from the bottom up, sometimes it saves a lot of print time making parts in multiple pieces. The platform has the mounting lugs built in and a notch that fits around the chassis rail. On the top of the platform there's a box that's a fairly tight fit to the radio, and on top of that we've got a lid. Now, it's not going to be watertight on its own, but we could always use some silicone to fix that if we really need to. First we'll fit the box to the platform with a couple of M3x6 countersunk screws. The holes in the platform have had an M3 tap run through them, so the screws go in nice and smoothly. Because of the large red lump that is the antenna on the 6-channel FlySky, we need to install it into the box before fitting it to the chassis. I didn't see the point in doing anything too complex, so it just gets stuck in with a bit of servo tape, just to make sure it's not going to bang around in there when the truck's running. To fit the platform to the chassis, we need a little spacer that fits in the channel in the chassis rail. With that lined up with the hole in the rail, we can offer up the platform and fit the M3x8. There's 2 more holes to fill, this time with M3x20s. The screws go through the chassis rail, through the side of the centre skid, and into the lugs in the platform, making a lovely stable place to mount the electronics. The ESC mounts to the platform in front of the box. Again, nothing special, just a bit more servo tape. We'll give it a quick clean with an alcohol wipe, so the servo tape has its best chance of staying stuck. I ended up needing 2 strips to get the ESC to clear the aluminium gearbox mount, but I think that's an okay compromise to make it work. The 1080 is of course fully waterproof, so there's no problem having it out in the open. In fact, it's probably better having it out in the air. It's going to stay a lot cooler. The wiring needs to be carefully stuffed out of the way. As long as the wires aren't going to be chafed or come in contact with anything that might get hot, they're going to be fine. Now, it's not quite ideal, as the steering servo lead runs in parallel with the motor wires, but I think we're going to get away with it. Currently the antenna is just loosely sat behind a battery tray, and it's not a bad spot, but there's nothing to keep it in position. So, surprise surprise, 3D printer to the rescue again. And keeping things simple, this little widget is shaped to partially fit around the red lump and has a lug with a hole in the end to attach to the chassis. All we do is offer it up and screw in an M3x8 button head with the post vertical. To attach the antenna, we just use a couple of small zip ties. They don't need to be all that tight, just enough that the roughness of the print grabs the softer heat shrink. With the antenna mounted there, it only just reaches. The coax isn't being pulled tight by any means, but you wouldn't want it any further back. It would have been nice to have an extra inch or so, but it's going to be plenty good enough. Next up, we've got the motor wires. Now, we could probably get the end of an iron in there to desolder the stock wires and solder on the ESC ones, but it's awfully close to the steering servo. It's going to be much safer to undo the 4 screws mounting the servo so we can drop it down out of the way. It's just a case of flipping the chassis over and removing the screws we fitted in a previous video. Now the servo can drop down into the chassis and there's plenty of clearance around the motor terminals. We should easily be able to get to them without melting something that we don't want melted. The first little job is to desolder the stock motor wires. We just add a bit of fresh solder to the end of the iron, or in this case solder gun, heat up the joints and gently remove the wires. With some setups it can be a bit of a trial trying to figure out which combination of throttle channel reverse on the transmitter and which way round to solder the motor wires will work. Luckily, quite a few ESCs, including the 1080, have a little feature that makes it very easy to get right. But before we do that, we need to tack the wires onto the motor. As long as there's an electrical connection, the joints will be good enough for what we need. I'm going to solder the blue wire where the black one went and the yellow to the red. Seems fairly sensible, but there's absolutely no guarantee it's going to be right. Next we can pop in a battery and have the transmitter at the ready, turned on and set up with the right model memory and the throttle trim at neutral and the channel reverse set to normal. Now we can connect up the programming card that comes with the ESC. It plugs into a special 3-pin connector on the side of the heatsink. Turn the ESC on and rather than powering up the rest of the system, the programming card lights up. The setting we're interested in is item 1, running mode. The default is forward/reverse, which is the usual mode for a crawler and what we'll end up setting it back to. But for finding the directions, we're going to set it to value 1, forward/brake. That means when the radio is telling it to drive forwards, it will, as usual, make the motor spin. But when we tell it to go into reverse, it'll only brake. But importantly, it won't spin the motor, making it easy to tell what the ESC thinks is happening. With the programming card unplugged, we can power up the ESC again so it's running normally. Now we can test it by gently pulling on the transmitter's trigger and seeing what happens. Okay, the truck runs backwards. That means we just need to swap the motor wires. If nothing had happened, and to get the truck to move we'd had to push the trigger away, we'd have to reverse the throttle channel too. Using the forward-only mode of an ESC is a nice simple way of getting it all set up. You just have to think a bit logically and go through what's happening. We can now solder the wires onto the motor terminals, with a bit more care this time, and while we're here we're going to shorten them a bit. We don't want the wires to run tight, so we'll still have plenty of extra. We just want to make sure that they can't find their way under the chassis and get pinched in the suspension. Before we set the ESC back to normal, we'll just try it again in forward brake mode, just to make sure we've got it right. This time when we pull the trigger, the truck should roll forwards, and when we push the trigger away, the truck should stay put. And that's exactly what it does. Perfect! So now we know it's all wired up correctly, we can turn the ESC off, connect up the programming card and set item 1 back to value 3, forward/reverse. Now when we power up the ESC for a test, we should be able to drive in both directions. And that looks pretty good to me. There's loads more settings to play with on the ESC. I could probably fill a good length video just going through them all. To finish today's video, all we need to do is reinstall the steering servo mounting screws so we can power up the model and check that the steering works properly. Just as the first time we installed them, the screws need to be nipped up, but not so tight that they're going to crush the plastic lugs on the servo. So there we go then, that's the electronics fitted and working. We could go out with it in its current state and give it a run. But I have to say I'm rather enjoying working on a nice pristine model, so I think I'm going to break a habit of a lifetime, and rather than giving it a test run after each mod and update, I'm going to continue doing the mods until it's more or less where we want it. So as always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and of course leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!